raw firepower. I mean, its importance it has not changed on the battlefield. Artillery is very important, and the Ukrainians for much of the war, I think at the peak when the U.S. aid was withheld, the Russians were firing 15 or 10 to 1, and at times I think 15 to 1. A couple of months ago, Zelensky said it was about 12 to 1. But both with some more military aid flowing in and Ukrainian drone strikes, long range drone strikes on Russian weapon depots, they've actually, from what I've been able to read, bring it down to about a 1 to 3 ratio. And so the Ukrainian drone strikes, I think even uh, last month near Moscow, where it registered a mini earthquake. And so these long range drone attacks that are hitting these weapon depots are actually restricting Russia's ability to bring firepower, like this large firepower onto the battlefield. And so this, say, like the Storm Shadow missiles actually do have a role to play in determining whether or not Russia can bring that raw firepower to the battlefield by hitting those weapon depots. Yeah, I mean, I think back in February when Ukraine started hitting those Russian oil refineries, the Washington Post was reporting that the Biden administration was furious at the Ukrainians and telling them to back down, and Ukraine did the opposite. They continue to double down on that strategy, and then later in the year, there were supposedly peace talks to happen in Qatar, to not bomb one another's energy grids. And so what that showed is that Russia understands strength, Russia understands power, and when inflicted with enormous damage, it will bring the Russians to the table. And so just even looking at that scenario is the more weapons and crossing of these supposed Russian red lines, the more that it's actually likely to bring Russia to a table, and the more that we cower and we back away, the more that the Russian Putin and the Russian elite will believe that they just need to continue the war of attrition and grind the Ukrainians out, and they'll take all of Ukraine. And so I think I believe his name was John Sullivan, but he was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, both under the Biden and Trump administration. And reading his article or interview in the Foreign Policy magazine, he spoke about how the Russians negotiate. They have extreme paranoia. They shoot for the moon, and they always have maximalist demands, and they don't budge at all. And so the Russians, feeling that they have the upper hand, will just go for everything. And we saw that Putin, to even kick off negotiations, he said that at a minimum he wants to keep all the land that Russia occupies now, and just to even start the demand. So if you think what a final settlement outcome for Russia could look like with maximalist demands, I mean, ultimately they want Ukraine to capitulate, and they're not going to waver from that.
And I wonder, David, to what extent you think there is significant damage already being done to Russian oil depots and other energy supplies inside Russian territory. I mean, we mentioned those drone strikes that Ukraine have been launching. How severely is that affecting Russia at the moment?
Well, I mean, I think in the initial months, the Russians had to put an oil embargo on, and they, sorry, excuse me, they had to put an oil embargo on, and definitely the Russia was not able to export as much, and I think there were signs that it was painful. I think as time went on, I think the effects became not as strong as it was initially, but the Russians still continue to feel it. I think it's hard to get clear data, but the fact that the Russians wanted to negotiate and come to Qatar with the Ukrainians to try to put a pause on the Ukrainian drone strikes meant that it definitely was painful, and the Russians were feeling it. In Chasiv Yar, I spent time with a drone unit, and essentially what I saw and what the commanders were telling me is that the only reason they're holding the entire front line there in Chasiv Yar is because of these drones. And so every day, every night, you see the Russian meat grinding assaults where the Russian men just run across the fields, or into the city and try to take the position. And then the Ukrainian drones are dropping bombs, bottles of liquid flammables on the Russians. But the Russians are getting smarter. So instead of charging in groups of 20, they'll charge in maybe groups of 4 or 6. And they'll spread out. So even if an FPV drone tries to hit them, it doesn't take them all out. And they also move on bicycles, on motorcycles, on quads, so that it's not as they're more maneuverable, and so you rarely see a heavy armor uh, or like a BMP driving near the front. But then with enough Russian soldiers that gather into a building, it can take them a week, it can take them 2, and majority of them will die. But once enough Russian soldiers reach say a bunker or a basement of a building, they get in and they just start digging and dig and dig and dig so that Ukrainian bombs can't hit them. And say after a week, 10, 20 Russian soldiers finally make it into those dugouts of that basement, then the Russians will drop glide bombs, shoot artillery, their fighter jets. They'll drop everything on the Ukrainian positions nearby. Then the Russian infantry that gathered in that position will run over into the next building or to the next street. And so, very gradually, the Russians are able to take street by street, building by building, after they just destroyed everything. And Ukraine, they're not able to take out these fighter jets or the planes that are dropping these glide bombs. And so, until something changes, losing its most motivated men to defend these lines when it doesn't need to be that way. And I think the most painful lesson of this was in Avdiivka earlier this year when the U.S. was withholding aid. So, and that's when the Russians really began to turn up the notch with using glide bombs. And so the soldiers told me when they were stationed in Avdiivka, um, it was dozens and dozens of glide bombs throughout the day, throughout the night, and they held their ground, but they sacrificed. They were losing their best men for it when it didn't need to be that way. And so, to compensate for the lack of artillery in a lot of parts of the front line, they use drones. But drones are very effective in the sense that they're accurate, they can hit the position, but still, in Avdiivka especially, the jamming, the electronic warfare was so intense that drones were very limited in the area at times. And so, in a sense, drones are very effective. They change aspects of warfare, but you just can't change the raw firepower and its effects on the battlefield. To me, when I was out there on the battlefield with the drone unit, and you're just standing out there, to me, like when I see analysts or some commentator on TV, like look at these battle maps and talk about it, then when you're standing out there in the front line, uh, it just feels like there's such a disconnect, and the battlefield is so chaotic. There's just drones hovering above you constantly, both enemy and friendly drones. All you hear is drones around you, and the night sky lights up from bombs being dropped. You just hear like tanks nearby driving, um, uh, and artillery both in and out, and it's just such a chaotic and hellish environment that yeah, it's astonishing to me that Ukraine has fought this well and for this long with so little resources. And like the Ukrainian soldiers tell me, if we had more, if we had more weapons,
Mm.
we'd be able to do a lot more on the battlefield. Final point that I would make is around AI in warfare. So we see the Ukrainians and the Russians using it in numerous aspects. And so Ukraine has been using Palantir software to help with its targeting of both for artillery firing, drone targeting. But we also see that there's always going to be countermeasures developed to the countermeasures. So when drones became common across the battlefield and the Ukrainians were using them very well, the Russians were very powerful at using electronic warfare and jamming these drones. And so the next front is going to be who can develop drones that are resistant to electronic warfare, and that can fly to their target. And so even if they were to lose connection, say in that final mile or final kilometer of delivery, and the connection is lost, that drone can take over at least the autonomous system, and drive and fly directly into that target and hit them. And so I think even Anduril, one of the rising stars of the U.S. Private sector, they've been testing some of one of their Bolt drones, autonomous drones, and so they've been testing it in Ukraine, like other weapon companies. But really, Ukraine is at the center of training these AI drones. They have all the battlefield data. They're training these algorithms, teaching them how does a Russian tank move, what does a Russian soldier look like. And to me, really, my big concern after talking with Ukrainian soldiers are, we've seen that Russia doesn't abide by international law. Ethics doesn't mean anything to the Russians. So what happens if we develop fully autonomous systems and they're flying out there and the Russians start getting, they suffering devastating casualties, but then they decide, why don't we just dress up like civilians and walk around the front line dressed like civilians? Will the Ukrainians actually uh, develop the AI to hit these civilians? And even recently, I was talking with some of the Ukrainian units, and what they've been taking losses from Russian special forces dressed in Ukrainian uniform, coming behind their lines and hitting their positions. And so the Russians will do anything and everything that they can to try to gain a battlefield advantage. And so what the right answer is, and how to develop these autonomous systems, or I mean, even if you develop them the right way, what happens if you're able to connect a cyber attack and take over one of these autonomous systems and turn it back against the operator? But I think what we see is just wars evolving very fast, very rapidly. There's the introduction of new technologies is happening every day, and wars changing faster than we've ever seen before.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.